Lorwyn, Chapter 8. Reese felt pain creep into his skull, and it pushed him over the foggy line into consciousness. He had been adrift in an endless black cloud, buried alive but floating freely. Then the sting hit, like a twinge of a pulled muscle. It quickly spread until he could feel the bones in his head buzzing. His nose and lips were sealed shut by clinging darkness, but there was a fire yet in his lungs that demanded a release. A wave of nausea rushed up his throat, and for a moment he saw Colfanor, glaring in disapproval. That was also tinged with sadness? Gruesome pride. The used splendid needles shivered and fell as Reese gaped, unable to tell whether the image was behind his eyelids or in front of them. Reese's lungs convulsed explosively, but he sucked in as much dirt and grit as he coughed out. He smelled seared flesh and burning wood as his fingers scratched deep into the lush forest soil. Blinded by tears and a fine dust that still hung in the air, Reese coughed again as all the muscles in his torso cramped. The boggarts, he thought. The pack. The packs. Reese's vision was blurry, and his legs were unsteady, but he forced himself to his feet. He tried to call out Griffith's name, but the words never cleared his throat. Reese staggered against a greasy black-trunked tree and weathered another surge of dry, racking coughs. At least everything that was still meant to be inside of his chest was... much of it was even intact, and those were things to be thankful for. Reese's vision cleared with a few splashes from his water skin. He drank what remained, tossed the skin aside, then slowly stood and wiped the smoke and grit from his eyes with the back of his hand. Though awake, he found himself surrounded by a nightmare. He was still within sight of the ash forest of Porringer, standing at the center of a 100-foot diameter circle of foul, blackened trees. Nothing green or growing had survived, and if the caustic, magical film of poison continued to spread, the entire area would be nothing more than a pit of slime and bones. Bodies were everywhere, hundreds of them, elf and boggart corpses alike, some intact, some unrecognizable. The alignment of the bodies and the bending of the trees showed Reese the center of the explosion was directly at his feet. The conclusion was inescapable, that it was true, however impossible it seemed. He had done this, and he did not know how. It was you magic. It was more powerful than anything Colfanor had ever described. His ears still ringing, Reese took a stumbling step forward and thought better of a second step. Slowly, painfully, he filled his lungs and let out a sharp, strong whistle. The trail talk signal for any nearby hunters to regroup on Reese's mark. He stood for many minutes among the choking death haze, but the only sounds he heard were his own rasping breaths. There was nothing alive. Nothing moving of its own volition so far as Reese could hear, and elf ears could hear a long way indeed. Reese risked another step, and then another. He was not sure which way to go, but his duty was clear. He had to search for survivors. Everyone around him was definitely beyond help, but there was perhaps an elf or two to save. Reese's heart grew stronger, and his mind grew sharper as he staggered on. He heard the welcome and familiar sounds of forest life as the local birds and bugs returned to the scene of the explosion. He also heard footsteps. Reese contemplated calling out, but he was unwilling to give away his position until he recognized friend or foe. His bow gone, he slid a sharp, angular dagger from its sheath and held it ready by his side. Whoever approached was not making much of an attempt to be stealthy. Reese was sure it was not the careless stumbling of a boggart, nor was it the light, graceful tread of an elf. It sounded like something in between, perhaps a long-legged boggart walking on tender feet, or a wounded elf forced to limp. An elf woman emerged from the smoky haze. Reese's fingers tightened around his dagger. "Hold there," he said. The elf froze in place. She was definitely not native to the Gilt-Leaf Wood. She was taller than any female he'd ever seen, taller than even the perfects of Liz Alana. The newcomer's porcelain skin was shaded with flushes of rose on her cheeks. Her hair was jet black and cropped to shoulder length, glossy and luxurious beneath a pair of smooth, sleek horns that curved back along the top of her head. Her eyes were dark and deep, and her intense expression marked her as someone who took in far more than most before she spoke. The odd female was dressed in typical elven threads, but in hues of amethyst, sapphire, jet, and silver instead of the gilt-leaf green and gold. She was unarmed, but she wore a small serviceable pack on her back. The newcomer was lean and athletic, but her rich yet practical attire was more suited for court than the hunt. Perhaps she was an all-purpose troubleshooter for a higher-ranking elf of whatever nation she called home. She looked at Reese without fear, only curiosity. She tilted her head to one side, fixed her penetrating eyes on the elf, and said, "I am holding here, friend, like you said. What happens next?" "Who are you? What are you doing here?" "Who are you?" she shot back. "I am Dane Reese of the Hemlock Pack," Reese said, deciding not to burden the newcomer with the recent change in his rank and status. "This is Gilt-Leaf territory. Identify yourself and your tribe." "I am a traveler from the forest of Mornsong. My name is Marilyn." "What are you doing here, Mornsong?" Marilyn smiled, slightly flushed. "I am lost," she said. "I've been lost for days, maybe weeks. I was part of a wedding party, you see, and we were attacked. I barely escaped with my life." Her face grew sad and introspective. "I saw a perfect die, Dane Reese. It was horrible." Reese realized Marilyn must be of a much higher status than her desperate appearance indicated. He moderated his tone, addressing her as if she were his peer. "It's no safer here, lady. We've had boggart trouble." "I gathered," Marilyn replied, suddenly animated. "Yes, it was boggarts that attacked us. I remember now. They were mad. Not like any boggarts I've ever seen. When the perfect was killed, I fled. I ran away into the woods." She cast her eyes to her feet at the admission, though Reese, having seen the mad boggarts in action, could not bring himself to blame her for running. "By the time they stopped chasing me, I had no idea where I was. I managed all right for a while, but, well, to make a long story short, I saw a flash and heard a roar, so I came to see what happened." She glanced around at the killing ground. "So, what happened?"
"First, you must answer my questions. What is your purpose in the Gilt-Leaf, traveler? Should you not have returned to your people after your wedding party was attacked? You're a long way from home."
The woman's head straightened, and her face lost its quizzical air. Her voice was soft, almost mournful, and tinged with a morn-song burr. "I am," she agreed. "My home feels as if it is beyond the far end of the world. My mistress was the perfect Paradala, the most beautiful voice in all of the morn-song, perhaps in the whole world. I was her attendant, her maid-in-waiting, her strong right hand when one was needed." She held her arms up and framed her face with her hands. "I am here due to a sad fate, or if you prefer, unfortunate circumstance. Fairy lights twinkled in the eaves of the day I was born, and the spiders in the nursery cast webs of pure spun gold, or so I was told. I carry a curse, perhaps not one that you can see, but a curse all the same. I should have never agreed to serve Paradala. If I had not, she might well still live."
Marilyn lowered her hands and cocked her head once more. "As you say," Reese said.
He thought for a moment, relieved that the ringing in his head was almost completely gone. There was still pain, but he was able to think clearly. This woman was unusual in appearance and accent, and there was something else. She didn't quite smell right. Her scent was close to what he would have expected, but there was an undercurrent of something strange to his sensitive nose. Her story also stunk of convenience and coincidence. On a hunch, he sprang forward, drawing his dagger as he moved, and proceeded to prick Marilyn's upper arm with the tip of his blade before she could blink. Hey! The dark-haired elf clapped a hand to her bicep and backed away, eyeing Reese warily. What was that for? Reese paused. There was a small drop of red between Marilyn's fingers and another on the dagger. She followed his eyes on the blood trickling across her knuckles. You've laid me open, Dane Reese. What is wrong with you? My apologies, Reese said. He sheathed the dagger and drew a leafy bandage from his belt. I had to make sure you weren't wearing a glamour. He offered her the leaf. It's just a pinprick. Don't overreact. You, Giltleaf, must employ some pretty big pins. Marilyn did not seem angry exactly, but her eyes had an outraged intensity that Reese felt he deserved. One apology is more than anyone should expect. I had to startle you to see if you'd reveal your true form. Marilyn grunted dismissively. She muttered, He thinks I'm wearing a glamour. Reese gestured with the leaf. I have offered my apology. I am offering redress. Marilyn reached out for the leaf. As her fingers took hold of it, she said, And how are you, Dane Reese? Is there any medicine in your pack for serious head wounds? She took in his confused expression and tapped on one of her own horns. Not my head, yours. It would seem I'm not the only one who's been cursed, I'm afraid, and I'm not the one who needs a glamour. Reese ignored her rambling talk of curses. The Mornsong were famed for their heavenly voices and infamous for superstitions that would make a Kifkin blush, and waited until Marilyn took the leaf from his hand. Hold it over the wound, he said. Press tight. It wasn't deep. She obliged, and a look of relief passed over her face as the healing magic went to work. Reese let her recover for a few seconds and said, Did you see any other elves or boggarts on your way here? Oh no, there was a rush of activity in the opposite direction right before the flash. Rodents and birds, but after that... She nodded down at the forest floor. Only this. Only you. Did the boggarts do this? Reese fell silent. Marilyn peeked at the skin under the leaf on her arm, smiled, and then folded it up. She offered it back to him. He shook his head, and she slipped it into the sash around her waist. She said, Please, tear. What happened here, and how did you survive? I don't know, but I mean to find out. She lowered her head respectfully. May I join you? As I said, I am lost, and somehow I must get word back to my people about Peridala's fate. I had hoped to reach the spires of Lizalana. I am sure they are distant, but they are not nearly as distant as my home. You're right about that, Reese agreed, and he considered her request. His first responsibility was to find whatever remained of the pack. He had no real idea how long he'd been unconscious. However, and given that he now had a civilian on his hands, he decided a return to the Tersen's fortress in the deep woods was the first order of business. Any other elf survivors would surely head there, and he could unload this beautiful stranger on the next patrol heading back to Lizalana. All that aside, he was alone and injured. He could use some company. Even unusual company, such as this Mornsong woman. Reese nodded. I can take you to safety. There's an elf stronghold not far from here. You'll be able to find your way to the capital from there, I'm sure. Marilyn raised her head and arched one sharp brow. Shall I be welcome there? Not entirely, Reese admitted. Fair enough, she said, and thank you, Dane Reese. But if I may be so bold, will you be welcome there? What do you mean? I mean, well, as I said, You have a serious wound. I was not merely speaking in jest when I said you are cursed." The dark-eyed woman suddenly sounded hesitant. "Have you seen yourself? I suspect your guilty friends would find you a bit more disturbing than me, at least at the moment. We Mornsong aren't quite as obsessive about appearances, and since I too am cursed, I cannot bring myself to disdain you. But your people—" She trailed off into a shrug of sympathy. Reese had to put aside the pain in his limbs and his head, but a new, dreadfully cold sensation squirmed in his guts. He stared blankly as Marilyn reached into her pack and pulled out a thin metal box with an ornate clasp on its lid. She exhaled on the box's underside and polished it with her sleeve. With a last anxious glance, she offered him the box. Reese watched his own numb fingers close around the metal box and raise it to his face. The reflective surface was not large enough to contain all of his features, so he centered on his eyes, nose, and mouth. Apart from a layer of soot, an angry red welt on his cheek, and a spattering of blood in his brow, he saw nothing out of the ordinary. "Higher," Marilyn said nervously. "Your forehead." Reese tilted the box. The cold in his stomach exploded, and an icy numbness shot up his spine and settled in his brain. His horns were gone. The left had broken off 2 inches above his forehead, leaving a jagged, irregular spike where once had been a smoothed, regal curve and a fine, tapered tip. The right was charred and blackened, ending in a rough stub of crumbling dust halfway up its length. Reese's knees buckled, and he dropped to the ashy ground. The box tumbled from his fingers, but Reese still cradled the awful memory of his reflection as tears streamed down his face. "I am an eye-blight," he said in a hollow monotone. "I am nothing." "Calm down, Ter, please," Marilyn said. "In the morn song—" "Damn the morn song," he cried. "I'm a monster. I am less than nothing. The Scarblades couldn't have done a better job disgracing me." He clenched his fists and stared at the strange traveler. Her face twisted with concern, and he said, "I am not fit to lead, nor to hunt, nor to even call myself an elf. I am no longer blessed. How can you even look at me?" Marilyn stood quietly as Reese's breath rasped in and out. "Eyeblights are treated with perhaps a little more compassion by my people," she said. "And again, we are more than less in the same accursed straits. Losing my mistress, failing her as I did, will shame me as much as any blighting. You have another option, though." "Morn song," Reese said hotly. "If I were still among the faultless, I would kill you where you stand." "I only meant—" "You meant I should hide myself behind a glamour, a lie. I would cut my own throat before doing what you suggest. Perhaps your backward tribe accepts eyeblights, but you are in the gilt-leaf wood now. We are the perfection of perfection. I would rather die in disgrace before—" His voice fell. "Glamours are tricks, diversions, and frippery. They can fail in the heat of battle." Marilyn bowed her head again. "I only meant you might put on the glamour long enough to get me to this stronghold of yours." Without lifting her chin, she added, "Perhaps the Gilt-Leaf Way is not the only way, Ter." Reese sputtered, unable to articulate the furious rush of emotions overwhelming him. "It's selfish, I know," Marilyn said, ignoring Reese's outrage. She looked at Reese pleadingly. "But I've been lost for a long time. I've had to do what is necessary to stay alive. I am capable for a courtier, but I'm no hunter." The tumult inside him suddenly fell silent. Reese nodded to Marilyn, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, in simple recognition of her presence. He felt his mind growing still, and he wouldn't have her thinking he had just abandoned her. "Please wait here," he said. "Where are you going?"
Reese didn't answer. He settled onto the ground, cross-legged, eyes closed, with his palms pressed into the soil beside his hips. His horns were gone, and no matter what the mad elves of the Morn Song thought, he was an outcast forever barred from the nation. For that matter, he doubted he'd be accepted in Marilyn's tribe either, even if he wanted to find refuge there. She was, as she said, in need, and was clearly overlooking his hideous deformity for pragmatic reasons. Reese pushed thoughts of tribes and disgrace aside with great effort, and drew on the arcane force of the deep woods, on the potent currents of power that sustained the elves and drove their magic. He shaped that power and sent it into the ruined ground around him, feeling the blast zone as if it were a wound upon his own body. He wanted to reach out to Colfanor himself, but at that moment he was impossibly removed from the necessary state of mind. So Reese prepared to do the best he could do on his own. As much as he had avoided the old red log these days, his mentor had given him the tools he needed to heal the damage he had done. He just had to do as he'd been trained, clear his mind and take considered action. Colfanor had taught him to think before he acted, and while Reese had never faced circumstances this dire before, he was still dedicated to living up the best parts of Colfanor's teachings in the service of the elf nation. He felt the death all around him. What had he done? It was no rhetorical question. Reese truly could not conceive how this had happened. He could find a trail or rally a pack or heal a battlefield wound well enough, and his poison magic was unmatched. But destruction on this scale was far beyond his skill. He wouldn't know where to begin casting such a spell, or where to find the magic to fuel it. The ground was lifeless, cracked in some spots and bubbling in others. He had done this to the forest, to himself. Every fallen limb, tree, and corpse pointed inwards at him with a silent accusation. He would ask the forest for guidance, gauge its reaction to what he had done and his continued presence here. If it forgave him, he would rise and lead Marilyn to the camp. If it cursed him, he would simply sit here until he died. Reese felt the vibrant life force at his command seeping through the blasted ground. There was no interaction between the two. Whatever he had done here, it seemed like it would have long-lasting effects. Whatever he had killed would stay dead. Behind closed eyes he imagined the forest around him, as it had been at dawn, before the ill-advised attack on the Boggart Festival in Porringer. Full and green and teeming with life. Rich browns and deep greens flooded the scene as far as the mind's eye could see. He held this image for a moment, trying to savor it, to capture it in his memory forever. Then a liquid, tingling sensation flushed through him, and his vision of the forest changed. The leaves of the trees shone with a reddish light that sparkled and danced like rain at sunset, spreading down the leaves to the stems, to the branches, and then to the thicker boughs and limbs, and on to the stout trunks themselves. Then the glow spread to the forest, the rich verdant colours slowly melting into a soft haze of scintillating shapes, shrubs and vines of yellow and white light, flowing silver trunk shapes that drifted, broke apart, and then merged again, like oil in water. The dreamy sensation sharpened into painful clarity. Reese opened his eyes and saw the changes were not just in his mind. The forest around him was a swirling kaleidoscope of shapes and colours that only vaguely resembled the forest in which he sat. "Dane Reese?" Marilyn's voice was tight and anxious, but she did not sound afraid. "Something's happening," she said. "Is this your doing? Is this gilt leaf magic?" "No," Reese said, "but I think I know what it is." The wound he had inflicted on this place must have been even more severe than he had thought, and he would be called to account for it by the highest, most august authority. High overhead, among the blackened skeletons of the trees, a proud, magnificent animal form gained definition and substance within the chaos. It glowed in eerie green as it emerged from the miasma of colours and shapes.
Reese, what is that?
Reese had no answer, at least not one that would help Marilyn understand. It most resembled a mountain elk, but much larger. A pair of glorious white eagle's wings spread from the figure's back and grew until they spread improbably over the scene of destruction, filling the sky. Despite his fresh deformities, Reese could not find in himself to be ashamed. His shame would have sullied this rare, perfect thing.
Tear, please, Marilyn said. Should I be frightened?
No, this is something few have ever seen, and even fewer elves have ever seen, Reese said at last. An elemental, a manifestation of the highest form of magic. Power so strong it becomes a living, immortal thing.
Marilyn stepped beside the elf, slightly behind him. What does it want?
I cannot say. I think it is angry.
She considered this. Can we run?
Reese shook his head.
Why not?
You see the wings, yes? How will you escape its reach? Reese said. Whatever its purpose, we will have little say in the matter.
Then we are doomed. The great elk spirit aura had filled the forest with unearthly green light. It snorted for its huge black nostrils and fixed its glowing yellow pupils on the pair.
I do not think so.
Can you not do something? Reason with it? Scare it off? Appease it? Your kind do so love to tell others what to do. Surely this is no different.
Reese shook his head, not even bothering to defend the honor of the gilt leaf.
Well, can you do anything? Marilyn asked,
fear edging into her voice for the first time since he'd met the strange elf. I can fall to my knees and wait for the spirit's judgment. You should do the same.
Don't be asinine. You have to try. I'm a stranger here. She waved her hands, her voice rising in panic. You're the local hero. You killed the forest. You went into a trance and summoned that thing, so just, I don't know, send it back.
I can't.
Then do something. Anything. An ethereal chorus of droning voices rose up as the elemental snorted again. Its wings expanded, folding over themselves until Reese and Marilyn were completely sealed within a dome of ghostly greenish white. The elk's face grew distorted as the spirit bellowed angrily. It drew back and opened its jaws as if to bite. Reese reflexively drew his dagger and said a silent prayer to his mentor. He was honestly unsure whether he meant the dagger for the elemental or himself. Colfanor, he thought, my path has led me here, and here is where it will end. Forgive me. Reese called once more upon the vital force of the forest, gathering its strength and its healing power. Marilyn was right. He was ready to die, but not for this beautiful stranger to die along with him. He would stand against the spirit for as long as he dared, and then he would use the last of his strength to protect Marilyn. It was a far nobler death than an eyeblight like him deserved. But the Morn Song had endured the sight of him, and perhaps she would speak well of him some day. The elemental stopped, its hot breathing forming clouds of sparkling steam around its muzzle. The elk spirit made no further hostile move towards them, but simply loomed there, gazing down on them as its gleaming white throat rippled and its teeth clicked together. It's trying to talk, Marilyn said. No, it isn't. They are beyond words, beyond our understanding, Reese said. They do not talk. They... Wait. By the woods. You might be... I can hear it. You can? What is it saying? It's difficult. Reese marveled at the glorious spirit despite the danger it posed and the guilt he felt. It's like remembering the details of a picture you've long forgotten. Well, then what are the details? Reese emptied his mind. He thought of nothing but the great elk before him and the sentient power that flowed from it. It has begun, Reese said.
though he knew the thoughts were not his own. The words came out of his mouth with a haunting echo that vibrated along his entire spine. The mountains will move. The rivers will reverse its course. The sky will burn and scream. It cannot be stopped.
What? Marilyn roughly nudged his shoulder. What are you saying?
Leave here, Reese said, still not in control of his tongue. Harm follows wherever you go. Return to your own, creature. Be gone, and let me heal the damage you have done.
Marilyn prodded Reese. But what does it all... Reese whirled on her, then, his eyes flashing with energy.
Leave,
he said sharply and with forceful intent, and a moment later he pitched forward, landing on his hands and knees. He blinked and coughed, suddenly in control of his voice once more, and spat up something like moss. The presence of the great elemental spirit withdrew, and he longed to follow, to stay in that exalted state of communion. It fled from him, however, leaving him empty and hollow. We have to go, he said simply. It does not want you here, or me. Marilyn paused, watching as the great spirit pulled back its wings. The phantasmal lights faded slowly as the setting sun reasserted itself through the smoke and the haze. What did I do? asked the Morn Song.
I only heard as much as you did, Reese said. It wants you gone. It wants me gone.
I'll go anywhere that isn't here, she agreed, provided that you're still going with me.
Of course. Reese shook his head sadly, trying to dispel the last of the crushing emptiness the elemental had left behind. Though I don't see why you'd feel any safer in my company. He gestured up at the rapidly fading spirit. I am twice cursed, once by my own hand and now by the elementals themselves.
I've got no doubt that I'm better off with you. Marilyn pointed to the last vestiges of the elk's horns that were still visible in the trees. That thing was ready to devour us, but you made it back down. Reese laughed harshly from the back of his throat.
Hardly. That was divine primal force of life. It could have destroyed you and me both with less than a thought if it cared to.
But it did not care to, Marilyn said. Not once you stood up to it.
The spirit had wholly gone, and the forest was fully restored to its blasted, blackened state. The wind whistled sadly through the ruined trees. Reese listened to the mournful sound, his fists clenching tight.
Is it safe to leave? Marilyn asked.
You, Morn Song, really don't know much about your own world, do you? Reese said. It's safer to leave than to stay, and the sooner we begin... The elf trailed off, his ears orientating to the west.
What now? Marilyn asked.
A party, Reese said, coming this way, fast. He motioned for Marilyn to get behind him, and the dark-haired woman quickly complied. He sniffed the air experimentally and thanked the ancient gods of Guiltleaf that his sense of smell, at least, was unchanged. 2, maybe 3 people on foot. A Kifkin or a boggart, and something bigger. They're on foot and travelling light, but at least one of them is armed. There are more than 3 scents, though. Strange. Not enough footsteps.
Marilyn smirked. Can you tell what they're wearing?
Quiet, Reese hissed. He thought, but didn't add, and you still don't smell right either, and I can't tell why.
All right, then. Can you tell if they're friendly? Marilyn ventured.
Not from listening, Reese said, which I can't do if you keep talking. He straightened up and took a deep breath. Never mind, we'll find out momentarily in any case.
Marilyn muttered something Reese didn't catch, then louder again she said, Forgive me, Tear. Your secret will be safe with me. Reese cocked his head but didn't turn away from the approaching sounds.
What? He asked,
his vision blurred, and he felt the light, smoky skin of glamour settling around his head.
He tilted his neck, and the familiar but impossible shadow of his intact left horn fell across his eyes. Hot rage surged up his throat, and he whirled, snarling. What have you done? Marilyn's face was concerned, almost pleading. Shh, she said. They're almost here. It's only temporary to prevent impertinent questions. You, shouldn't have to answer to the likes of them. Reese clenched his teeth tightly. Marilyn's glamour was strong and subtle, expertly cast. It would take time to dispel, and once it was gone, he'd have to face whomever was approaching and endure their pitying stares. We will discuss this later, lady. Reese planted his feet in the ash and sheathed his dagger, though he kept his hand on its hilt. His shoulders square and head high, Reese waited as two women broke through the underbrush. He had been correct. The two runners were a Kifkin archer and a flamekin. They were careful as they entered the scoured-out clearing, but the flamekin could not keep her eyes from widening when she saw the elf and his unusual companion. Are you Reese? The flamekin called. Dane Reese of the Hemlock Pack? Reese nodded. I am Aisling, a pilgrim. This is Bridget Bailey, an archer of Kinsbale. We bring an urgent message from Culfanor. Aisling would have been lying if she'd said she'd enjoyed the company that had been forced upon her. A flamekin's pilgrimage path was meant to be a solitary one, a journey that shaped and was in turn shaped by an individual. As travellers and wanderers, the pilgrims touched the lives of many others, but only briefly. As messengers, they bore news to others, the dire and the wonderful, items trivial and profound, yet they themselves were unaffected by it. Flamekin did not typically read the missives they carried, and if they did, they felt the words as keenly as the sender or recipient. Like all pilgrims, it was Aisling's custom and her preference to travel alone whenever possible. She had learned and accepted long ago that it was not as possible as often as she'd like it to be. On those occasions when wisdom or necessity dictated against her natural inclinations, Aisling did her best to not trouble or be troubled by her companions. Yet this Bridget Bailey troubled her. In fact, the archer's formidable aura of ego had already pushed Aisling beyond troubled and onto genuine annoyance. Bridget clearly knew the terrain. She hiked with all the confidence of an experienced ranger. She even hummed cheery tunes as she forged ahead of Aisling through the woods, finding and following hidden paths before the flamekin had a chance to see or a chance to choose for herself. Bridget laughed off all of Aisling's milder objections, and when the flamekin had pressed the point, Bridget had grown sullen, and had pressed on ahead all the more forcefully. At least the Kifkin stopped humming songs about herself after a while. The last thing Bridget had said before she started to sulk was that she knew the shortest route to Reese's territory, and that Aisling should follow her if she wanted to complete Culfanor's mission quickly. Aisling did not argue, but kept close behind Bridget, watching and waiting for the chance to honestly disagree with the archer's trailblazing, so that she could strike off on her own. The path presented itself to the pilgrim, it was true, but the Kifkin archer seemed intent on taking the path by the neck and taming it like a wild springjack. Culfanor himself had admitted he didn't know exactly where his student was, so Bridget's best guess was no better than Aisling's, despite the archer's superior knowledge of the region. As the pair moved deeper into the woods, Aisling was sure she heard faint, familiar titters on the path behind them, and had little doubt the Vendilion clique was, for whatever reason, shadowing them. It wasn't uncommon for a clique to do such things, for a trio to find someone or something interesting for a day or two, just long enough to become nuisances. But this trio was starting to get on the flamekin's nerves. She lost sight of Bridget for a second, but as soon as the flamekin broke through the particularly thick holly hedge, she saw the Kifkin standing silently on a large rock, shading her eyes with her hand as she peered into the dense forest ahead. Aisling walked up alongside the rock so that she was shoulder to shoulder with Bridget, and tipped back the wide steel brim of her travelling hat. We're being followed, the archer said. Bridget did not lower her hand and didn't look at Aisling. I know, Aisling said. I think it's the fairies I met at the river. Bridget shifted her feet but kept her eyes fixed on the terrain. Are they playing with us? Or is there some kind of grudge between you? Playing, most certainly, the Flamekin smirked. What, you've never picked up a click on a long journey? Maybe they seem harmless to you, but fairies can make a real trouble in the deep woods. They'll stir up the wildlife with their tricks and their magic, then flit away, leaving us to sort out the trouble they've caused. That's a terrible thing to say. The happy, airy voice floated down from above them. We only ever try to help, said a familiar but slightly deeper voice from behind Aisling. Though sometimes we get carried away. Quiet, Visa. Or distracted. You're not helping, Endry. Children of Una, Aisling said. Show yourselves so that we may discuss terms. Bridget's brow creased and the Kifkin sighed. She lowered her hand and hopped down from the rock as the three fairies flitted into view, hovering in the brightly coloured circle of light from their glittering wings. Terms, the big one Ileona asked with a laugh. Are you looking to make a deal? We don't work cheap, Flamekin. You don't work at all, Visa. Shows what you know, Endry. Visa batted her huge glittering eyes. We're doing terms. Ileona shrugged, unconcerned. Please ignore the twins. Way ahead of you. Now, the Kifkin and I are on a mission, Aisling said. What will it take for you to leave us to it? Oh, no, no, no. Ileona shook her head. We came all this way. We're not going back. We want to watch. We want to help, and you can't stop us. Bridget looked up at Aisling. Her voice was low, barely above a whisper. They're right. They will do what they please, no matter what bargain you strike. Do tell, Aisling said with a spark of irritation. The trio flew in faster circles. That one's too mean for a Kifkin. She'd be mean for a boggart. But she's famous. Oh, very famous. The Zero of Kinsbale. Aisling addressed Bridget in a quieter tone. Ignore them. What do you suggest? The archer let her hand fall so that it rested on the lower tip of her bow. Aisling's flames flared brightly in surprise, distorting the air around her head. She hesitated. Together, she and Bridget might be able to chase the fairies away, or at least discourage them for a time. It would not be a pleasant chore. Would it be worth the effort? Would another irritating clique appear to take their place? And really, shooting arrows at fairies? A waste of ammunition. We do not want to fight, the trio said together as if reading her mind. Endry smiled sharply and added with an unfairy-like hint of real menace. But we will. Ileona broke off and flitted down to Aisling's eye level. You shouldn't fight us anyway, she said. We saved you from the river. Aisling's flames cooked. The only thing more wasteful than a skirmish with these tiny flying irritants would be to try and recount the tale of that incident. They're right, Aisling said to Bridget. I'd be another stone at the bottom of the Wonderwine if not for them. She looked back to Ileona and nodded. All right, you can come along. Like you could stop us. But you have to keep quiet and stay out of our way, Aisling said. The Kifkin nodded slowly, agreeing, though she was clearly no more enthused about Aisling's suggestion than Aisling. Or else we'll see how hot those wings of yours can get before they burst into flame. Agreed? Ileona buzzed happily around Aisling's head. Deal. Twins, listen up. We just came to terms. She hovered, her expression coloured by a momentary flash of confusion. Wait, what are we doing again? I'm looking for someone, and Bridget is helping me. You need to leave us alone and let me look. We can do more than that. We can help. It's far better if you just watch, Aisling said. She glanced down at Bridget and added, I'm the pilgrim, after all, and this is my path. To Aisling's surprise, the surly Kifkin smiled, her lips stretching across her wide, round face.
All right, Flamekin. Point taken. Ashling nodded gratefully as the fairies' voices poured down on them in a fresh deluge of enthusiasm. Which way are we going? The smaller female Visa squealed as she rose over her siblings and swooped between the low-hanging branches of the knot bowl. I'll scout ahead. No, Ashling said. Just stay behind and follow me, all right? Visa, Ileona said firmly. Crestfallen, the lone twin buzzed lazily back down to the others. How much farther to elf territory? Ashling asked Brigid. Not far if we keep going at our pace, she said with a meaningful glance at the fairies. If nothing else slows us down, it'll be less than an hour. Ashling was about to answer, but a strange sound stopped her. She felt a flush of heat rise to her face as the air itself shifted away from her, as if a giant were preparing to sneeze. Ashling smelled ozone and felt the presence of something she could not name. A presence that disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving the Flamekin feeling not unlike a rabbit fortunate enough to meet a predator that had already eaten its fill. There was a brief flash in the sky like a sheet of lightning. A moment later, a blinding crescent of light rose above the tops of the trees. The shape intensified, and Ashling saw the rest of the sphere take shape. A massive ball of crackling energy. The sphere was too distant for Ashling to tell how truly large it was, but she saw it expanding outward, and she could feel its terrible force even from here. The ground shook violently as if something like thunder rolled across the forest. Ashling winced at the sound. Brigid clapped her hands over her ears. Even the fairies were buffeted back by the shockwave. Seconds later, a dazed Ashling jumped up onto the large rock. The energy ball was gone, leaving a black and smoking hole in a dense green canopy. The ground continued to shake, violently enough to shift the boulder under Ashling's feet. If the tremors were this strong here, they must have been strong enough to rip trees up by their roots closer to the center of the blast. The rumbling died away. Ashling stared at the sight of the explosion as she spoke to Brigid. Less than an hour if we maintain our pace. That's right. Ashling faced the Kifkin. She smiled. And if we run like stuck springjacks? Brigid smiled back. Only one way to find out. She slung her bow up and across her shoulders so that she could extend her legs to their full stride. It would have been comical to Ashling if she hadn't seen Brigid on the trail. The archer's legs were little, but she was swift and nimble when she chose to be. What was that? Ileona said. You know, that thing that just happened? It hurt my ears. It hurt my feelings. I think I broke an antenna. I'll break your antenna. I do not know what that was, Ashling said before the twins came to blows. She took off her hat and tied it to the thin strap on her belt. Her flaming hair and eyes blazed brightly. Who wants to go and find out? Race you. 1, 2, 3, go! Last one there is a stinky boggart. With a flurry of sparkling light and high-pitched giggling, the fairy trio streaked on ahead. Ashling turned to Brigid and said, Shall we join them? You go on, the hero of Kinsbell said. I could probably keep up with you for a while, but we Kifkin weren't built for long-distance sprints. Just go. I'll be right along behind you. Ashling nodded, feeling more respect for the archer than she had the entire journey thus far. It took self-knowledge to admit such a thing, even more when one was a living legend. The Flamekin touched her fingers to the brim of her hat in a half-salute, then turned and plunged into the forest, her long legs driving her towards the site of the explosion. The fire in her body surged, making her limbs loose and light. Her boots dug into the turf as she weaved between trees and hurdled thickets. As Ashling entered into the blast zone, the ground cracked beneath her feet, and she missed a step. She half stumbled and righted herself, slowing to a brisk jog. The signs of elf skirmishes littered Lorwyn. Dozens of sacred copses planted as memorials to the fallen. Ashling has been to many, She had carried messages and prayers to such sites dozens of times, but she had never seen one so fresh after the slaughter. She glanced left and right as she ran along at her reduced pace, overwhelmed by the scene. The trees, the rocks, and the ground itself had been stripped bare and covered with greasy black film. Countless smouldering bodies still lay face down in the ruins, unrecognizable as members of any particular species. Flamekin were creatures of fire, so Aisling knew that none of her tribe's flames had caused this destruction. It didn't even smell of fire, as much as it reeked of incendiary energy. The distinction was fine, but a flamekin could recognize the difference between simple combustion and the raw power of fire magic. The wisest and most experienced mages among her kind had the ability to unleash such pure, infinite combustion, but they also had complete control over their flames and were trained specifically not to cause such utter destruction. She had seen one tribal elder demonstrate this heat and precision by conjuring a perfect fairy-sized cage of flame that fit its occupant like a second skin. So long as the fairy didn't move, it was unharmed. If he touched the flames, they'd burn his bones to ash. The tiny creature had volunteered for the demonstration, and though he was completely unharmed, Aisling never forgot the frozen, awestruck look on the fairy's face when the flames flickered out. This was not fire damage at all. At least the fire had been a secondary effect of the energy she'd seen. Some kind of caustic, withering force, more like a potent acid than a crackling flame. It was as if the life force of everything in that area had burned its way out and through whatever it had inhabited. The devastation grew the nearer Aisling got to the epicenter. If she let herself be distracted much more, she'd lose all momentum and wind up wandering, dazed and weeping. Her path was calling her, urging her on, but for a change she almost dreaded what lay ahead. She leaped over a narrow stream, and her boots sank into the mud on the far side with a chilly sizzle. Before she could extract herself, the fairies were there, buzzing in circles around her face. "Better wait here. There's no room ahead. Something big is taking up all the space." Aisling paused, concentrating, but she felt nothing. "What do you mean?" "We decided to wait here for a moment. You should wait too. It's bad luck to intrude on such things." "What things?" Aisling craned up on her toes to see over the next ridge. "What did you see?" "Silly pilgrim," Lisa said. "Didn't you hear? We didn't see anything. It wouldn't let us near." "What wouldn't?" Endry's eyes suddenly glittered like small blue stars. "All clear," he said. The azure sparkle spread out to his sister's eyes, and all three fairies buzzed towards the ridge with a merry giggle. Aisling heard something small and fast moving towards her, and she waited. Brigid splashed across the narrow stream and dropped to one knee beside Aisling, panting lightly. "What's happening?" "Whatever it is," Aisling said, "it's over. Come on." She started towards the ridge. "You were never that far behind, were you?" "I didn't want to miss anything. Not with the fairies about." The two women broke into a run until they cleared the ridge. Aisling planted the sole of her boot in the center of a thick bramble thatch, and Brigid clambered over the bramble. Aisling rocked forward on one leg, keeping the stinging vines safely pinned below her foot, and hopped into a clearing that was shrouded in a foul-smelling haze. An elf warrior stood beside a strange-looking woman at the far side of the clearing. They both looked like they had seen better days, but the elf was especially dour. Aisling ignored the prattling fairies. "Are you Rhys?" the flamekin called. "Dane Rhys of the Hemlock Pack?" The solemn elf nodded. "I am Aisling, a pilgrim. This is Brigid Bailey, an archer from Kinsbale," Aisling said. "We bring an urgent message from Culfanor."